and welcome into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is, it is Tuesday, November 19th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start just breaking down the playoff tiers. We are getting very close to the home stretch here, and want to break down just where everyone sits, at least in my mind, as of right this second. Then we'll get to the playoff math. We'll kind of break down where everyone is going to come from, which conference is going to get the most teams. Feels like it's going to be the SEC, but maybe a little bit of tie between the SEC and the Big Ten. We'll also get into the ACC, the Big 12, the Group of 5, and Notre Dame. We'll get into all the scenarios that could unfold from that. Then we'll get to the Week 12 winners and losers from this past weekend. Definitely a lot, including a lot of people outside of Athens, Georgia, are not very happy right now, and I'll break it down in that segment. Then we'll get into Week 12 superlatives, a ton of big-time things, and maybe the game of the week down there in Columbia, South Carolina. And then we'll get to my top 15 Tuesday, all the teams that I think are the best going into the Week 13 slate. I thought about mixing it up just a little bit, but I kept with the status quo. Didn't want to mix up the way I was going about business at least too much. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $sign, add any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that as you please. And also, GSMCPodcast.net is still up and working, does the exact same thing. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing, because we got to get to these playoff tiers. We are getting very, very close to the finish line. It feels like we know remotely where everyone stands as we head forward, and one of these teams feels like they are already in the field. But let's go ahead and break this down, and we'll start with the teams that if you handle business, you are in. And I think if you handle business in the regular season, I'll get into the bubble here in a second, and we'll talk about some different teams that could face some trouble even if they win out. But as of right now, let's get to the teams that if you handle business, you are in no matter what. And it's this group. Oregon, frankly, probably already in, if I'm being totally honest. I think if they could lose next weekend to Washington after the bye, they could lose in the Big Ten championship, and they're still probably hosting a playoff game. I think that's probably how this is going to go. So Oregon's in a really good spot right now. I think they're probably in regardless of really whatever happens the rest of the way. I think Oregon's probably in the field, and that's the only team that's probably in the field right about this moment. But Ohio State, they just need to get to Indy. Obviously, an 11-1 Ohio State that goes to the Big Ten championship is not getting left out. Even if they get blown out by Oregon, maybe if they lose to Indiana, they could still find their way in. I think they would still be in a good position. I don't think it would be a great position necessarily. You'd have a loss to Indiana and Oregon. You'd have a win over Penn State. You'd be up against, Tennessee and a couple other teams that we'll talk about here in a second. So I think they do have to get to Indianapolis. I tend to believe that they'll do that, but we'll get into that here in the rest of the week when we break down that big-time game that's going on in Columbus this weekend. But Penn State also here at Minnesota this week is a little bit sketchy, no doubt about that. But if they get through that and they get through Maryland, they're going to be in, no doubt about that. I feel pretty confident that they would host a game in that scenario, but I still think there's some mixing around that could possibly happen. But if they do lose one more, I think they would fall below Tennessee. I think they would be the team that would probably get left out from this conference at the end of the day because don't necessarily have that marquee win. If you do get two losses, I think we've all found that that's probably where you get knocked out. If you don't have that big-time win like Tennessee has over Bama or Georgia has over Texas and Tennessee and a lot of different things happening in the SEC that's keeping some of these teams in, just won't be there for Penn State. So if they lose one more, they are fully out. If they win out the rest of the way, I expect them to be hosting a playoff game. And then you got Georgia. They might have punched their ticket on Saturday. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because Georgia Tech does everything in their ability to confuse things and make things a little bit tougher. So we'll find out in the last weekend if they fully have gotten in, but I expect them to get in. And hypothetically, they can still get to Atlanta if Alabama were to fall to Auburn in a couple of weeks or Oklahoma this weekend. So still a lot on the table for this Georgia Bulldog team, but UMass, Georgia Tech, win those two games. You are in, probably traveling somewhere else, but we'll see how all of that shakes out. And then Ole Miss, the team that beat them a couple of weeks ago, they're just sitting there waiting for a trip to Gainesville. A terrifying place to go play right about now. So it's going to be really tough, and then they get Mississippi State, obviously, in the Egg Bowl to finish it off. Those two wins, you would definitely get in. Now, that Florida game is a little bit sketchy. We'll get into that one tomorrow, but definitely one to watch. And this Ole Miss team, I think they're a team that if they got in, no one should want to play them. But we'll get into that throughout the next couple of weeks. For Alabama, they are in the SEC title if they win out. And even if they lose that game, I think they would still be in. There are some interesting mathematics there. But when we talk about the CFP and all of this stuff, punishing the loser of the Big Ten or SEC championship is something that they kind of can't do. And we'll get into that kind of throughout the week, but it would be a death sentence in a lot of different ways. So I wouldn't necessarily love that. I think Alabama, if they get to the SEC championship, is absolutely in. We'll see what happens. Obviously, a 10-3 Alabama is going to be one of those weird teams, but I don't think the loser of the SEC or the Big Ten is really going to get punished too much. Then we got the CFP bubble, and I'll start with those two Texas teams. They're only on here because of the game at the end of the year. I think if they both win out, go to the SEC title, I think they're probably in. A&M's another team that could be that 10-3 team in that scenario. Texas could be 11-2 with maybe not quite the quality win that Tennessee has over Alabama, but they would have gone on the road and played at A&M. So that would have given them a little bit of a leg up. I imagine if they get to the SEC championship, both of these Texas teams are in. Obviously, it's going to come down to that last game. Whoever wins that one in College Station is going to be the team probably in the SEC championship. They have a couple of games this week that we'll talk about in the upset alert segment tomorrow, so it could get a little bit interesting down the stretch. But at the end of the day, I do think one of these two teams will be in the SEC championship. One team will be fully out, and it will come from that game, which just cannot wait for. And then you got Notre Dame. I think that's a team that they're on the bubble until zeros hit on that USC game, and they have a win. They need to go 11-1, especially with the loss that they have. Frankly, I could easily make the argument they should be out even at 11-1, but the CFP has proven their point. Notre Dame will be in if they go 11-1. If they lose one more, they are officially out. For Indiana, they're in a tough spot. This is an ultimate test weekend, no doubt about that. Everyone at the CFP rankings is going to be watching them very, very closely. We probably won't know if they passed that test or if they failed it until the rankings come out next Tuesday, which is very, very frustrating. We'll have to wait multiple days for this to kind of be resolved. But we'll kind of know on Saturday. We'll be able to at least tell with our football brains what Indiana did, how close they were to winning, all of that type of thing. We'll be able to kind of decipher that. But we won't fully know until those CFP rankings come out, and Tennessee is going to be the team that's watching it very closely. Tennessee can win out and miss the CFP. I feel very confident about that. I think if Indiana were to win this weekend, obviously, but if they were to lose this weekend by 3 points, there's no way they should be out. There's no way they should be out even if they lose by 17. But we can talk about that in time. That's obviously a big debate that's been going on. But there's a ton of teams on top of them that can fall. Right now, they are that 13th team, at least in my mind. Maybe we'll be told something different in the rankings tonight, but they would need a Notre Dame to fall. They would need Indiana to get rolled this weekend. They would need maybe another SEC team to fall out. Ole Miss loses to Florida this weekend. A&M or Texas loses Kentucky, and it opens up some things just a little bit for them. So this is kind of the group where you're going to do your best. If you win out, I think for Texas and Texas A&M in particular, and Notre Dame really, if you win out, you are in. Tennessee is in that kind of weird spot. Indiana, if you win this weekend, you're definitely in. If you lose this weekend, then you just have to wait for those rankings and hope that it comes up you. But then you got the championship and in crowd, and that's really the Big 12 and the ACC. That's really kind of the end-all, be-all of this. Miami, we've talked about it. They got to win out the rest of the way. If they don't, it will be Clemson SMU in that championship game. For the Big 12 teams, you got Colorado. It's simple. Just win. Get to your conference championship. If you lose this weekend, everything kind of falls apart because you don't have the tiebreakers that a lot of other teams have in the Big 12. You are going to have to win out, no doubt about that. So a tough game this weekend that we'll talk about tomorrow. We'll break it down, but they're 3 wins away from a CFP berth in Deion's second year. It's just insane. I'll talk about it. I'm going to break that one down a little bit later in the week because I don't think people are fully appreciating how insane that is. But BYU came back to the crowd just a little bit this past weekend. The good news is they had a little bit of a buffer. They're going down to Arizona State this upcoming weekend. They win. They're likely in Arlington, barring some crazy turn of events in the last weekend. For Arizona State, they win this weekend. They're in a really, really great spot. It's not necessarily, they're going to the Big 12 championship where they can punch their ticket this weekend, but if they can take care of Arizona, which a lot of teams in the Big 12 have been able to, they should be in a great spot, and they should be in the Big 12 championship. You also have Iowa State here. They're kind of in a weird spot where they're going to need a little bit of help. They're a little bit in a pack that we'll talk about actually here in a second. But Iowa State, they're still very much in this, need a Colorado loss, but at the end of the day, they win out, Colorado loses this weekend, they're right back in that race. And then Oh, excuse me. And then you do have SMU, obviously the team that is leading the ACC right now. If they lose the next 2 weekends, then it could be Miami Clemson in the championship. I know that sounds crazy, but that is still technically in the cards. I don't expect them to lose the next 2 weekends. If they win this weekend, they're going to Charlotte for the ACC championship. And then you got the group of five gang. It is three teams, pretty much. I mean, barring disaster, it is three teams that will get into this thing one way or the other. Boise State seems to be the one that's kind of leading the way. As of right now, I've said my piece on Boise State. I think Tulane's a better team in the group of five. I also think Boise State has a ton better resume. So the argument can go either way. I'll talk about it actually a little bit later when I break down my top 15. But Tulane is a team that they're just hoping for a Boise State loss at some point. That is what they're waiting for. If they went out the rest of the way, if Boise State loses one more, I believe that Tulane would be in. Maybe Boise would still get that nod depending on the way those games go. I think Tulane at 11-2 would get in over an 11-2 Boise State. Still up for debate, but we'll see what happens. And then Army, if you win this weekend, I think you're in the driver's seat. I think you would jump Boise State. You would be the team that would have that group of five slot, but then you would also take it from Notre Dame. So a lot of things would kind of shift around in the rankings there. But at the end of the day, we could see maybe Boise State and Army in that rankings at the end of the day. But it's going to be really interesting to watch. If they beat UTSA at the end of the year and then beat Tulane, they probably would need another Boise State loss, but at the end of the day, they could get in even if they lose to Notre Dame this weekend. It's just got to be a couple more things that fall their way than normal. And then the still technically in it, but not really in it group is pretty much the rest of the Big 12. The Big 12 still has 8 teams that are technically alive for Arlington. So oh, excuse me, my throat's killing me today. But technically, Kansas State, Baylor, Texas Tech, West Virginia, and TCU, as well as Iowa State and all the other 3 we just talked about, are still in the conversation. I know that sounds crazy. They still can technically make it. Absolute chaos happens, and it's the Big 12. So we'll keep you updated there. I don't think any of those teams will make it to Arlington, but this weekend could decide a lot of that. And then South Carolina. I would be shocked if South Carolina find a way in. I don't think they should be in. I think taking that third loss should eliminate you in pretty much every single conference, in pretty much every single year. Obviously, that changes from year to year, but in this year in particular, a 9-3 team just shouldn't get in. Now, we can talk all day about whether or not South Carolina should be 10-2 because of that LSU game, but at the end of the day, they are 9-3. We have to work with what we have, and it sucks to see, but that's a very, very good team that's building towards 2025 in a very real way, regardless of what happens the rest of the way here. So, a tough end of the season where you feel like you're one of the best, 12, 15 teams in the country, but you did lose 3 games early. I don't think any of these teams are really in it, but technically they are in it if everything goes crazy the last couple of weeks. But it's been really hard to break all this down. I mean, we do have one off the list. I think Oregon's in regardless of what happens the next couple of weeks. They are already in the Big Ten Championship. I talked about it. I don't think the CFP committee is going to be able to really punish anyone that loses in the Big Ten or the SEC Championship in this format, because then there would be some meetings between the Big Ten and the SEC about finding their own place to play. But that's a conversation that is going to build over the next couple of weeks, and hopefully we won't have to deal with the reality of that. But definitely something to watch, and we'll get into the math of all of this. We'll get into how many Big Ten teams are getting in, how many SEC teams getting in, how many ACC, Big 12, Notre Dame's a huge piece in this, and we'll break down a little bit of that Indiana-Tennessee conundrum that is making a lot of people on Twitter mad. But I'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.